The growth in inequality in the United States, particularly since the early 1970s, I think has been one of the most striking social trends over the last 3 or 4 decades. And there's been a lot of research on that, and most of that work has emphasised the role of education. College graduates have increasingly earning more and more than high school graduates. But over this same period that income inequality has been increasing, American labour unions have also declined really substantially. If we look at men, back in 1972, 34% of those workers were union members. Today, the number's around 7 or 8%. The unionisation rate for women has always been much lower. In 1972, their unionisation rate was about 16%, today below 6%. At a very basic level, what unions do is sign contracts for all of the workers in a workplace and sets the wages for those workers. Normally when people look at the effects of unions, they look at the wages of union members. But unions had much broader effects than that. They had cultural, political and institutional effects. Non-union employers were often looking at unionised firms to figure out what their wages should be in order to be competitive. And this means that the wages of non-union workers were also influenced by the presence of unions in the labour market. We saw then that the effects of unions were very broad. They extended well beyond the workplaces they were organising. And this was because they exerted this effect in politics, keeping alive the political conversation about equity among workers, and they had this cultural effect. So there were norms in the labour market in which people had beliefs about what a fair level of wages should be and what a fair distribution of wages should look like. Inequality has 2 components, really. The difference between groups of people and among certain groups of people, the differences within those groups. We're really fortunate to have survey data across the whole population from 1972 to today. We're looking at workers and we know their age, their race and their level of education. And we're looking at men and women separately. And one big thing that unions do is that it increases the wages of less educated workers, high school educated workers, and makes them more similar to the wages of college educated workers. The other thing that unions do, because of the way union contracts and so on are structured, workers with the same characteristics, their wages are compressed. So it turns out the really big effect of unions on inequality is that it makes the wages of workers with similar characteristics more similar. So if we were to go back 30 years, and look at a worker, high school graduate, 40 years old. If we were to look at all workers with those characteristics, among union members, their wages would be very similar. The level of inequality among them would be very low. And then if we look at non-union workers, their wages would be very different. They'd be working under all sorts of different conditions and their wage inequality would be very high. Now, a lot of different things explain the growth of inequality in America. Globalization, immigration, education. We found that deunionization explains about 1/3 of the growth in inequality for men and about 1/5 of the growth in inequality for women. I think we're in a place now where we're searching for alternative forms of organisation that can help preserve wages, help promote norms of equity and fairness in the labour market. I don't think it's going to look like the old industrial unions of the 1970s, and it's a very open historical question at the moment, how we're going to solve this problem. In part, I think it would look like a living wage movement in which, say, municipalities would promote a respectable level of wages for people. But I think part it requires some active organisation where the target for organisation is no longer the workplace. It seems that that is too difficult to do in the American labour market. But what if unions organised communities? Or what if other groups organised communities? Maybe that type of organisation could promote the norms of equality and fairness that have been lost in the American economy through the period of rising inequality.